Welcome, nighttime traveler, to Sleepy Bedtime Stories, your haven of stories and tales to help you sleep. This is the place where traditional tales come to life and accompany you on your journey to rest. But first, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I'd love to know if you're joining me from your bed, from a cozy sofa, or perhaps from some corner of the world where you can still feel the spirit of ancient tales. Please leave me a comment. Every message from you is like a fragment of a precious amphora. If you'd like to support this space of peace and relaxation, subscribe and share the channel so that more people can find their refuge here. And now, take a slow, deep breath, because tonight we're going to dive into another thrilling story.
The last lighthouse still lit on the silent coast. Chapter 1. When the sea learned to be silent. The fog rolled in from the west like a white shroud, creeping across the waters of the Atlantic with a slowness that seemed calculated, almost deliberate. It was the 23rd of March, 1947, when the lighthouse keeper Tomás Mendoza observed that phenomenon from the upper gallery of the Punta Serena lighthouse. A limestone colossus that had withstood the storms for 112 years. The fog was unlike any he had seen before in his 26 years of service. It did not carry the scent of saltpeter and seaweed that characterized sea mists, nor did it move with the capricious restlessness of the coastal wind. This fog advanced in absolute silence, and with it, something fundamental in the world began to transform. Tomás lit his heather pipe, that evening ritual that marked the start of his night watch, and watched as the white mass devoured first the black cliffs of the bay, then the small fishing boats returning to port, and finally the horizon itself. In a matter of minutes, the lighthouse was enveloped in a whiteness so dense it seemed solid, as if the building had been transported inside a cloud. It was then that Tomás noticed the silence. A silence so profound, so complete, that it caused a strange dizziness in his chest. The constant roar of the waves against the reefs had ceased. The squawking of the seagulls nesting on the lighthouse edges silenced. Even the wind, that perpetual companion of every lighthouse keeper, had vanished completely. During the early hours, Tomás tried to convince himself that it was an unusual but explainable meteorological phenomenon. He had read about temperature inversions, about atmospheric conditions that could create surprising acoustic effects. But when he descended the 243 spiral steps to the base of the lighthouse and opened the heavy oak door leading outside, what he found defied any rational explanation. The sea had come to a standstill. The waves, frozen in the midst of their eternal motion, formed motionless crests of water that reflected the light of the lighthouse like dark glass. Tomás stretched out a trembling hand and touched the surface of a wave. It was cold, liquid, but completely motionless, as if time itself had come to a standstill just for the ocean. The news reached the coastal village of Bahia Tranquilla at dawn on 24 March, brought by the young lighthouse keeper's assistant, Martin Salas, who had made his way down the cliffside path through the fog, his heart pounding in his chest. In the harbor tavern, the fisherman received his account with a mixture of disbelief and ancestral terror. They were men hardened by generations of life at sea, men whose grandfathers and great-grandfathers had sailed those very waters when the great three-masted sailing ships plied the Atlantic trade routes. They knew the sea in all its guises, furious and placid, generous and cruel, but never silent, never still. Captain Rodrigo Ferreira, a 72-year-old man whose face seemed carved from the very stone of the cliffs, was the first to walk down to the shore. The others followed him in a silent procession, leaving their nets and gear behind. What they saw confirmed the words of young Martin. The ocean, that blue giant which had rocked their cradles and fed their families for centuries, lay still as a mountain lake in the depths of winter. The boats in the harbor floated on a surface of water so smooth that they were reflected with unsettling clarity, as if there were two identical worlds, one inverted beneath the other. Over the following days, the news spread along the coast like an invisible fire. From the small fishing village of Cabo Norte to the bustling port city of San Sebastián del Mar, 300 kilometers to the south, the coastal inhabitants witnessed the same impossible phenomenon. The Atlantic Ocean, that colossal mass of water covering more than 106 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface, had ceased to move. The tides, that cosmic pulse governed by the moon's gravity for millions of years, had stopped. The ocean currents that carried heat and nutrients across thousands of kilometers, frozen in their flow. And above all this, the silence. A silence so unnatural that many swore they could hear the beating of their own hearts with terrifying clarity. The scientists arrived in Punta Serena on 1 April 1947. They had come from the university in the capital. Men in white coats and with chrome-plated instruments who set up their equipment at the base of the lighthouse with the mechanical efficiency of those who believe that every natural phenomenon can be measured, categorized, and explained. Dr. Armando Vasconcelos, an internationally renowned oceanographer, led the initial investigations. His instruments recorded temperatures, salinity, water density, and electromagnetic currents. They took samples from the still sea and analyzed them under state-of-the-art microscopes. The results were consistently baffling. Chemically, the water was identical to samples taken months earlier. There were no changes in its molecular composition, no foreign contamination, no physical alteration that could explain its unnatural behavior. But there was something the instruments could not measure. something that only those who had lived their whole lives by the sea could perceive. Tomás Mendoza put it into words one night whilst sharing a coffee with Dr. Vasconcelos in the lighthouse's duty room. The circular walls were covered with nautical charts, yellowed by time, and the light from a kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows that looked like figures from another world. "The sea has forgotten how to breathe," said the lighthouse keeper in a calm voice, almost resigned. "It has forgotten its purpose." The scientist tried to smile at what he considered a poetic metaphor, but there was something in the old lighthouse keeper's weary eyes, something in the absolute stillness that surrounded them, that prevented him from dismissing those words as mere superstition. Weeks turned into months, and the phenomenon not only persisted, but spread. Reports were coming in from increasingly distant shores. The ports of Lisbon and Casablanca confirmed the same anomaly. British Royal Navy ships reported that the North Sea had taken on the same supernatural stillness. In June 1947, the international scientific community was forced to accept a truth that defied centuries of accumulated knowledge. The Earth's oceans had ceased to behave according to the fundamental laws of physics governing the movement of fluids. The coastal economy collapsed with a speed that took even the most pessimistic economists by surprise. Fishing, an industry that had fed humanity since prehistoric times, became impossible. The fish, disoriented by the absence of currents, began to die in massive numbers, their bodies floating on the motionless surface of the water like withered flowers in an abandoned pond. Large merchant ships were stranded in the middle of the ocean, unable to navigate a sea without waves, without currents, without the movement their hulls had been designed to cut through. The ports, those nerve centers of world trade, became ghost towns where the quays rotted under the merciless sun and rusty cranes pointed towards a sky that seemed to have grown lower, more oppressive. But in Punta Serena, Tomás Mendoza carried on with his duty. Every evening, at 6:30 sharp, he lit the great lamp of the lighthouse. The clockwork mechanism that turned the Fresnel lenses emitted its rhythmic ticking, a sound that had become extraordinarily audible in the all-pervading silence. The light rotated in its eternal cycle, sweeping through the white fog that never quite cleared, rejecting its warning to ships that would never come, to sailors who had abandoned the Dead Sea. When asked why he carried on, why he used up kerosene every night for a purpose that seemed obsolete, the old lighthouse keeper simply replied that it was his duty, that as long as the lighthouse stood, its light must shine. There was something else behind his determination, something he never put into words, but which shone in his eyes as he gazed towards the invisible horizon, the hope that one day, perhaps, the sea would remember how to move and would need that light to guide its return. The inhabitants of Bahia Tranquila began to adapt to their new reality with the resilience characteristic of coastal communities. Without fishing, they turned to the land, cultivating the rocky slopes they had always considered too poor for agriculture. They learnt to raise goats on the cliffs and to weave their own clothes from the coarse wool of sheep grazing on the windswept moors. Life became harder, more austere, but it went on. However, something fundamental had changed in the spirit of the people. The children born after the silence grew up without knowing the sound of the waves, and when the elders told them stories of the roaring sea, of storms that shook the houses to their foundations, of waves as high as mountains, they listened with the same expression of polite skepticism with which one listens to fairy tales. Dr. Vasconcelos never returned to the university in the capital. So, mething in the mystery of the silent sea had captivated him in a way he himself did not fully understand. He set up a permanent laboratory in one of the abandoned rooms of the lighthouse station, filling it with observation logs, annotated maps, and increasingly sophisticated measuring equipment sent to him by colleagues still working in distant institutions. Every morning, he followed the same routine. He would make his way down to the rocky shore, kneel by the still water, and plunge his hands into it, as if, through touch, he could decipher the secret that the instruments failed to reveal. One August afternoon, as the sun sank towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that were reflected with perfect symmetry in the still sea, Vasconcelos made an observation that would change the course of his research. He noticed that the water, although completely still on the surface and in its main body, exhibited an almost imperceptible movement in its deepest layers. Using a hydrometer of his own design, he began to record what appeared to be extremely slow currents, so slow that they were measured in centimeters per day rather than kilometers per hour. It was as if the ocean had not died, but had entered a state of hibernation, reducing its vital processes to an almost undetectable level. He shared this discovery with Thomas during one of their late-night gatherings in the lighthouse's duty room. The lighthouse keeper listened in silence, smoking his pipe and watching as the rotating light of the lighthouse intermittently illuminated the walls covered in maps. When Vasconcelos finished explaining his findings with the restrained enthusiasm of a scientist who believes he is on the verge of an important revelation, Thomas nodded slowly. "It is dreaming," he said at last. The scientist blinked, confused. "The sea is dreaming," repeated the lighthouse keeper. "Is greater than I have spent 26 years observing it, speaking to it in silence during my night watches. The sea has a consciousness we do not understand, a soul that beats at frequencies our instruments cannot measure. And now it is dreaming." "Dreaming of what?" asked Vasconcelos, more out of courtesy than genuine scientific curiosity. "Of the beginning," replied Thomas. "Of the moment it was born, millions of years ago, when the first rains fell upon the barren earth and filled the empty abysses It is remembering how it first learnt to move. The month stretched out towards the first anniversary of the silence. The 23rd of March, 1948, dawned with a leaden sky that foreshadowed rain. Though the rain, when it finally fell at midday, it did so in a strange way, with drops falling slowly, almost floating in the air as if gravity itself had weakened. Tomas watched the rain from the lighthouse gallery, and for the first time in a year, he felt something akin to hope. The world was changing in ways no one could predict, but it kept changing. It was still alive. That night, when he lit the lighthouse as he had done for thousands of nights before, he did so with a renewed sense of purpose. The light from the lighthouse pierced the persistent fog with its steady pulse, a beacon not only for lost ships but for a old that needed to remember that even in the deepest silence, even in the most absolute stillness, hope could continue to shine. The events of that year transformed humanity's relationship with the ocean in fundamental ways. Coastal cities that had grown for centuries with their backs to the land and their faces to the sea began to reorient themselves. Major naval engineering projects that had been under development were cancelled. Naval academies closed their doors, and generations of accumulated maritime knowledge began to be lost as the old sailors died without apprentices to whom they could pass on their wisdom. But in places like Punta Serena, in solitary lighthouses that still stood along now silent coastlines, the guardians of the light continued their watch. Tomas grew old by the silent sea. His hair turned completely white, and his back was bent from decades of climbing up and down the lighthouse stairs. But he never failed in his duty. He took on a young apprentice, a 16-year-old boy named Felipe Morales, the son of fishermen who had been orphaned when his parents set out to sail the still sea on a desperate expedition in search of fish from which they never returned. Felipe learned the rituals of the lighthouse with the solemnity of a religious novice learning the sacred ceremonies of his order. He learned to clean the Fresnel lenses until they shone without a single speck of dust. He learned to adjust the clockwork mechanism that rotated the light with the precision of a Swiss watch maker. And he learned, above all, to observe the sea with the infinite patience that his trade required. Dr. Vasconcelos continued his research for another 15 years, until one spring morning in 1962, Tomas found him asleep at his desk, surrounded by his journals and maps, with an expression of peace on his face that the lighthouse keeper had never seen in his lifetime. Among the papers on the desk, Tomas found an unfinished manuscript, the result of decades of meticulous observations. The final paragraph, written in shaky handwriting that suggested it had been penned in the scientist's final hours, read, "After 15 years of intensive study, I have reached a conclusion that no scientific institution will accept. The ocean is neither sick nor broken. It is undergoing a process of metamorphosis that is beyond our comprehension. Perhaps the old lighthouse keeper was right all along. Perhaps the sea is dreaming, and when it awakens, it will be something completely new, something that our current categories and definitions will be unable to contain. I can only hope that when that awakening comes, humanity will be prepared for the ocean that will be reborn. The years flowed by like a slow but inexorable river. Tomás Mendoza celebrated his 80th birthday in the spring of 1968, surrounded by the few remaining inhabitants of Bahia Tranquila. The village had shrunk considerably. The younger generations had migrated to inland cities in search of opportunities that coastal communities could no longer offer. But those who remained did so with the stubbornness of deep roots, unable to imagine a life far from the sea, even a silent, sleeping sea. The celebration was modest: rye bread, goat's cheese, and homemade wine served in pewter cups. When asked to say a few words, Tomás stood up slowly, leaning on his wooden walking stick, polished by decades of use, and looked through the window towards the lighthouse that had been his home for over 40 years. He said only, "The light continues. As long as there is someone to light it, the light will continue. And when the sea awakens, it will find us waiting." That night, Felipe Morales, now a 34-year-old man with a family of his own living in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, helped the elderly Tomás climb the 243 steps up to the lamp room. It was a ritual that had become increasingly difficult for the old lighthouse keeper, but one he refused to give up. Together, they lit the lamp, adjusted the flow of kerosene, and set the clockwork mechanism in motion. The familiar ticking filled the circular chamber, and the light began its eternal rotation. Tomás sat down in his wooden chair, the very same one he had sat in during decades of night watches, and gazed into the darkness where the sea lay invisible yet present. Felipe sat down beside him, and they remained in shared silence, a silence that was different from the unnatural silence of the outside world, a silence filled with mutual understanding and the peace that comes from fulfilling one's duty, no matter how futile it may seem in the eyes of others. It was in the early hours of 4 April 1968 that the first significant change occurred since the sea had learned to be silent. Felipe, who was dozing in his chair whilst Tomás kept his silent vigil, was awakened by a sound he could not at first identify. It was so faint, so distant, that he thought it might be a figment of his imagination or a half-formed dream. But Tomás had heard it too. The old man had sat up in his chair, his eyes wide open and an expression of childlike wonder on his wrinkled face. "Listen," he whispered, and Felipe strained to concentrate. There it was, undeniable now, the faintest murmur of moving water. It was not the roar of the waves against the reefs that the elders' tales described. It was something much more subtle, almost shy, like the babbling of a small stream finding its way between the stones. They descended the stairs with a speed that was reckless for a man of Thomas's age, but which the excitement of the moment made inevitable. The lighthouse door swung open onto the night, and the rotating light of the lantern intermittently illuminated the scene before them. The sea was stirring. It was an almost imperceptible movement, small ripples that ruffled the surface of the water like breath on a mirror. But it was movement, genuine and undeniable. Thomas fell to his knees on the damp rock, and for the first time in over 40 years of service as a lighthouse keeper, tears ran freely down his cheeks. The sea was waking. After 21 years of slumber, it was beginning to remember how to breathe. The news spread with the speed that only extraordinary news can achieve. By dawn, all the inhabitants of Bahia Tranquila were gathered on the shore, watching with a mixture of joy and apprehension the gradual return of the sea's movement. The waves were still small, barely ripples on the surface of the water, but for those who had lived 21 years with a completely still ocean, they were as miraculous as the resurrection itself. The elders wept openly, remembering the sea of their youth. The children, who had never known any sea but the silent one, watched with eyes wide with wonder, trying to process this new and strange phenomenon. Over the following days, the sea's awakening continued with a slowness that was both frustrating and fitting. The waves grew gradually, from small ripples to modest swells, from swells to proper waves, which, though still much smaller than those described in historical accounts, were enough to make the abandoned boats in the harbour begin to rock gently at their moorings. The sound returned in layers, first the whisper of water against the hulls of the ships, then the more audible splash of the waves against the quays, and finally, as the most thrilling moment of all, the distant roar of the waves crashing against the cliffs, a sound that had been absent for more than 2 decades. Tomás Mendoza did not live to see the sea fully awaken. A week after that first night, when movement began to return, the old lighthouse keeper was found in his bed in the small room of the lighthouse that had been his home for almost half a century. He had an expression of profound peace on his face, and his hands, even in death, retained the shape of someone who had spent a lifetime turning keys, adjusting mechanisms and tending the light. Felipe Morales buried him in the small cemetery overlooking the sea, in a simple grave marked with a headstone of local stone on which he inscribed only Tomás Mendoza, Guardian of the Light, 1888, 1968. The light continues. And the light continued. Indeed, Felipe took on the full title of lighthouse keeper with the same solemnity with which his mentor had bestowed it upon him. Every night, without fail, He climbed the steps up to the lamp room and lit the lighthouse. From his elevated post, he watched as the sea continued its slow awakening, how the waves gradually grew in size and strength, how the currents began to flow once more, how, as the months passed, the Atlantic Ocean began to resemble more and more the sea of history books and the memories of the elders. The fish returned, first in small numbers, then in shoals that made the water boil with their abundance. The seagulls returned to nest on the cliffs, and their cawing, absent for 21 years, once again became the constant soundtrack of coastal life. Humanity, adaptable as ever, began to return to the sea. Abandoned ports were rebuilt. New generations of sailors had to learn from scratch the skills their grandparents had mastered, working with a few surviving elders who still remembered the old ways. Fishing boats began to plow the waves once more, though at first with extreme caution, as if they feared the sea might decide, at any moment, to fall asleep again. But the sea continued to awaken, continued to return to its state of perpetual motion, though those who studied it carefully noticed that there were subtle differences. The currents did not flow exactly along the same paths as before. The tides followed slightly different rhythms. It was as if the ocean had returned from its long slumber, with certain aspects of its fundamental nature altered in ways we were only just beginning to understand. Felipe Morales grew old in the lighthouse, just as Tomas had done before him. He trained his own apprentice, a young man named Ricardo Torres, in the rituals and responsibilities of the lighthouse keeper's trade. And when the time came, when Felipe felt his strength beginning to fail and his bones protesting against the 243 steps he had climbed and descended thousands of times, he passed on the responsibility with the same simple ceremony with which it had been passed on to him. The chain of Gua Dians continued, generation after generation, keeping the light burning through storms and calms, through changes in the world that would have seemed impossible to those first lighthouse keepers who had built the limestone tower over a century earlier. Historians and scientists eventually reached a consensus on what they called the Great Silence, that 21-year period when the Earth's oceans ceased to move in accordance with the known laws of physics. Theories abounded. Gravitational anomalies caused by the close passage of a massive celestial object, changes in the Earth's magnetic field, even intervention by extraterrestrial intelligences. But no theory could be conclusively proven. The data was insufficient. The observations from that era too fragmentary, and the phenomenon itself so contrary to everything science understood about the behavior of fluids on a large scale that many scientists simply preferred to regard the entire era as an unsolved mystery, an anomaly in the historical record that might never be fully explained. But in places like Punta Serena, in solitary lighthouses, along coastlines that had witnessed the silence and then the awakening, a different understanding persisted. The lighthouse keepers and the inhabitants of coastal communities who had lived through those extraordinary years passed on a different narrative. They spoke of the sea as a living being, conscious in its own way, capable of processes that science had not yet learned to measure. They told stories of how the ocean had needed to sleep, how it had dreamt of its own beginning, and how it had awakened, transformed in subtle yet fundamental ways. These stories were dismissed by academic S as picturesque folklore, poetic metaphors that simple minds used to make sense of phenomena they could not understand scientifically. But those who told them knew something that scientists, with all their instruments and equations, had overlooked, that there are forms of knowledge that do not come from measurement but from patient observation, of a lifetime spent alongside something greater than oneself. The Punta Serena lighthouse continued its vigil through the decades that followed. It survived the modernization that saw many old lighthouses automated or simply abandoned. It survived because there was something in its history, in its role during the years of silence, that had made it more than a mere aid to navigation. It had become a symbol, a reminder that even when the world changes in unpredictable and incomprehensible ways, there is value in keeping the light burning, in fulfilling one's duty, in patiently awaiting the dawn that must eventually come. The nights in Punta Serena took on a special quality, an atmosphere of profound peace that drew visitors from faraway places. They came to spend the night in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, which had been converted into modest lodgings, to sit on the lighthouse gallery and watch the light rotate in its eternal cycle, projecting its warning and its promise through the darkness. Many of these visitors were people going through their own personal silences, their own periods of stillness and uncertainty. They found comfort in the steadfastness of the lighthouse, in the knowledge that the light had continued to shine even during the darkest years, when the sea itself had forgotten its purpose. The current lighthouse keeper, a young woman named Isabel Campos, who had inherited the post from her grandfather, Ricardo Torres, upheld the traditions established by generations of keepers before her. Every evening, at 6:30 sharp, she lit the lamp. The clockwork mechanism, now assisted by modern electronic systems that served as a backup but were rarely needed, emitted its familiar rhythmic ticking. Isabel had grown up in the lighthouse. She had learned its rhythms and secrets from childhood, and could not imagine a life anywhere else. She knew every stone of the structure, every view from the windows, every variation in the sound of the wind as it blew from different directions. One late autumn night, whilst Isabel was making her evening inspection rounds, she stopped on the upper gallery and looked out to sea. The waves were crashing against the cliffs with a force that was perfectly normal, perfectly consistent with the oceanic behavior documented for centuries before the Great Silence. But Isabel, who had spent her life observing the sea, noticed the small differences that persisted. the rhythm of the W. Aves was slightly slower than historical records suggested it should be. The patterns of foam on the crests formed designs that did not exactly match the descriptions in the old navigation manuals. The sea had returned. Yes, but it was not exactly the same sea that had existed before. It was something new, something that was still in the process of defining itself. Isabel thought of Tomas Mendoza, the legendary lighthouse keeper who had kept the light burning during the early years of the silence, whose grave she visited regularly to bring wild flowers that grew on the cliffs. She thought of what it must have been like for him, watching, night after night, a completely still sea, without knowing if it would ever move again. She thought of the faith it must have taken to keep lighting the lighthouse, night after night, when all the evidence suggested that its purpose had become obsolete. And she felt a deep connection with that man who had died decades before she was born, an understanding that they shared something fundamental, the conviction that keeping the light burning was important not for its immediate practical use, but for what it represented, for the act of faith itself. The wind began to pick up, bringing with it the scent of salt and seaweed that was as familiar to Isabel as the beating of her own heart. Dark clouds were gathering on the western horizon, heralding the storm that the weather forecasts had predicted for that night. Isabel checked the lamp's mechanism once more, making sure everything was working perfectly. During storms, when visibility was reduced to almost zero and the waves rose like mountains against the cliffs, the lighthouse became what it had always been designed to be, a vital guardian. The difference between life and death for those navigating the treacherous waters off the coast. The storm arrived at midnight, as if it had been dramatically timed by some invisible theater director. The wind howled around the stone structure of the lighthouse with a fury that made the windows rattle in their frames. The rain pelted against the glass with the force of small stones being hurled. And the waves, those waves that had returned after 21 years of absence, crashed against the cliffs with a roar that was almost deafening, even through the thick stone walls. Isabel watched from the lamp room, keeping her watch as generations of lighthouse keepers had done before her. The light rotated in its eternal cycle, piercing the curtain of rain and mist, a constant pulse of hope amidst the chaos. At 2 a.m, Isabel saw something in the stormy darkness. At first, she thought it was an optical illusion, perhaps a distorted reflection of the lighthouse's own light. But then she saw it again, the navigation lights of a ship, appearing and disappearing amongst the huge waves. The ship was dangerously close to the reefs that stretched out like dark fingers from the base of the cliffs. Sharp rocks that had torn countless vessels to pieces over the centuries. Isabel felt her heart racing. There it was, the fundamental purpose of the lighthouse manifesting itself in real time, a ship in distress, sailors at risk, and the light that could mean the difference between disaster and salvation. She grabbed her night vision binoculars and took a closer look. It was a medium-sized fishing boat, the sort that operated in coastal waters. It appeared to be battling the storm, its engine clearly struggling to stay on course against the combined force of the wind and waves. As she watched, Isabel saw the boat getting closer and closer to the reefs. The sailors on board must have been seeing the lighthouse beam, that steady pulse warning them of danger. But the storm conditions were so severe that maintaining control of the vessel was almost impossible. Isabel reached for the emergency radio and began transmitting, identifying the ship's position and requesting assistance from the Coast Guard. Her voice was calm and professional, though her heart was pounding against her ribs with a force that rivaled the waves crashing against the cliffs. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Isabel's life. She watched, helplessly from her vantage point, as the ship battled the elements. The lighthouse beam continued to rotate, signaling the danger, showing where they must not go. The sailors on board, though Isabel could not see them clearly through the darkness and rain, were clearly using that light to navigate, to calculate their position relative to the deadly reefs. Slowly, with agonizing gradualness, the ship began to move away from the danger zone, its engine roaring against the storm, gaining ground centimeter by centimeter until finally, miraculously, it passed beyond the critical point and entered deeper, safer waters. Isabel exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with the sweat that the tension of the moment had caused. This was the purpose. This very moment. Generations of lighthouse keepers had kept the light burning for moments exactly like this. Tomas Mendoza had kept the light burning even when the sea was dead and no ships were sailing, because he knew that one day, somehow, that light would be needed. And here, on this stormy night, decades after his death, his faith had been vindicated in the most concrete way possible. The Coast Guard arrived an hour later, as the storm began to subside. They escorted the fishing boat back to port, ensuring there was no serious damage and that the entire crew was safe. Before leaving, the Coast Guard captain made a personal call to Isabel, thanking her for her quick response and professionalism. But it was what the fishing boat's captain said that truly touched Isabel's heart. Is greater than. His voice over the radio was choked with emotion as he relayed a simple message: tell the lighthouse keeper that his light saved us tonight. In total darkness, we thought we were lost. That light showed us the way. We will never forget it. Dawn broke with extraordinary beauty, as if the world wanted to make up for the terrors of the night with morning splendor. The sun rose over an ocean that had been washed clean by the storm, the waves still high but gradually losing their fury. Isabel extinguished the lighthouse lamp in accordance with established protocol. At exactly 6:45, when natural light was sufficient for navigation, she descended the steps slowly, feeling the weariness of a sleepless night, but also a sense of deep peace, of a mission accomplished. As she prepared her breakfast in the small kitchen of the lighthouse keeper's quarters, Isabel reflected on the long and extraordinary history of Punta Serena Lighthouse. More than a century of continuous service, through world wars and technological changes, through periods of prosperity and economic collapse, through the inexplicable 21 years when the sea forgot how to move. Through it all, the light had continued. Generations of keepers, each fulfilling their duty with the same dedication, had kept that tradition alive. And as Isabel ate her toast and drank her coffee, looking out of the window at the sea, glistening in the morning light, she knew with absolute certainty that she would continue to do so for as long as necessary. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Life in Punta Serena continued at its calm and steady pace, marked by the natural cycles of day and night, the rising and falling tides, the passing seasons with their predictable succession of changes. Isabel married a local carpenter, a quiet, hard-working man named Miguel, who understood and respected her dedication to the lighthouse. Together they restored the old outbuildings, repairing windows that had let in drafts for decades, replacing floorboards that had been worn down by generations of feet. Miguel built new furniture using wood salvaged from old ships that had been scrapped in the harbor, and every piece bore the stories of the sea in its grain. They had a daughter, whom they named Lucia in honor of the light that was so central to their lives. The girl grew up in the lighthouse just as Isabel had done, learning to walk in the circular rooms, learning to count using the steps of the tower, learning the stories of the keepers who had come before. On clear nights, Isabel would take Lucia up to the upper gallery, and together they would watch the light rotate, casting its warning and its promise through the darkness. She told her daughter about Tomas Mendoza, about how he had kept the light burning during the years of silence, about the faith required to continue fulfilling one's duty when all seemed hopeless. Lucia listened to these stories with wide eyes, absorbing the lessons they contained like a sponge absorbs water. And when she was just 7 years old, she asked a question that would stop Isabel in her tracks. "Mum, if the sea once slept, could it sleep again?" Her mother looked at her for a long moment, seeing in that simple question a depth of understanding that was extraordinary in someone so young. "It's true," she replied at last. "It could. That's why it's important that the light always continues, no matter what, because we never know when it will be needed." Lucia nodded solemnly, as if making a pact with herself, a promise for the future. The years passed with the inexorable gentleness of water eroding stone. Isabel aged gracefully, her dark hair taking on silver strands that glinted in the light of the lighthouse. Miguel, her faithful companion, developed arthritis in his carpenter's hands, but continued to work on smaller projects, carving figures of ships and seagulls which he sold to the tourists who occasionally visited the lighthouse. And Lucia grew into an intelligent and thoughtful young woman who studied oceanography at the university in the capital city, but returned home every summer to help her mother with the lighthouse duties. It was during one of these summers that Lucia made a discovery that would change the family's understanding of the events that had occurred so many decades earlier. Exploring the old laboratory that Dr. Vasconcelos had maintained, a space that had been preserved almost like a museum after his death, she found a set of notebooks that had been hidden behind a loose bookshelf. The notebooks contained detailed observations from the scientist's final months, notes that were increasingly philosophical and less scientific in nature. In the last entry, dated just days before his death, Vasconcelos had written something that made Lucia's heart race. "I have begun to suspect that the silence of the sea was not a random phenomenon, but a response. A response to what? I do not yet fully understand. But the patterns I have observed suggest an intentionality that is difficult to ignore. It is as if the ocean had been listening to something, or someone, and the silence was its way of processing what it had heard." Lucia took the notebooks to her mother that night, and together they read them by the rotating light of the lighthouse. Dr. Vasconcelos's words, written in handwriting that grew increasingly shaky as his health declined, painted a picture of the sea as something far more complex than science had ever considered. He spoke of distributed intelligence, of emergent consciousness in complex systems, of the possibility that the ocean itself might be a thinking entity on a scale that humanity could barely begin to comprehend. These were ideas that would have been dismissed as fanciful by the scientific community of his time, and probably still would be. But for Isabel and Lucia, who had spent their lives observing the sea from their privileged vantage point in the lighthouse, the words resonated with truth. The nights in Punta Serena took on a new depth after that discovery. When Isabel climbed the stairs to light the lighthouse each evening, she did so with a renewed awareness of the immensity of the sea stretching beyond the light. It was not merely a mass of water governed by physical laws and ocean currents. It was something alive, something conscious in its own way, something that had slept and awakened according to cycles that humanity was only just beginning to perceive. And the lighthouse, with its constant light, was more than an aid to navigation. It was a beacon of human consciousness in silent dialogue with the consciousness of the ocean, a point of contact between two radically different ways of being. The story of the Punta Serena lighthouse and the Great Silence was eventually documented by historians and writers. Books were published and documentaries were made in an attempt to capture the essence of those extraordinary years when the sea forgot how to move. But those who visited the lighthouse after reading these stories or watching these documentaries invariably reported that no book or film could truly convey what it meant to be there, in that specific place, feeling the weight of history and purpose. There was something about the physical experience of climbing the 243 steps, of standing on the upper gallery with the sea breeze lashing one's face, of watching the light turn in its eternal cycle, that transcended any description. Lucia eventually completed her studies in oceanography and returned to Punta Serena permanently. It was not a difficult decision. The capital city, with all its hustle and bustle and opportunities, had never felt like home in the way that the lighthouse did. She began working officially as the lighthouse keeper's assistant, learning from her mother the practical details of the trade that could not be learned from books. She learned to adjust the clockwork mechanism when the damp weather caused the gears to move less smoothly. He learned to clean the Fresnel lenses with the special solution that had been used for generations. He learned to recognize the patterns of the seasons, the subtle changes in the wind and waves that indicated what sort of weather was on the way. But he also brought new knowledge with him. His education in oceanography enabled him to interpret the sea's behavior in ways that previous generations had been unable to. He installed modern sensors that monitored water temperature, salinity, currents, and dozens of other parameters. The data he collected was shared with scientific institutions around the world, contributing to the global understanding of how the ocean had changed after the Great Silence. Because it had changed, in subtle but measurable ways. The current patterns were not exactly the same as those documented before 1947. The average water temperature was slightly different. Even the chemical composition showed minor but consistent variations. And so, the Punta Serena lighthouse continued its watch. Now, not only as a navigational aid, but also as a scientific observation post, a place where ancient tradition met modern knowledge. The light continued to rotate every night, exactly as it had done for over a century and a half. Sailors on ships passing through the darkness saw that light and knew they were in safe waters, that the danger of the reefs had been marked, that someone was keeping watch. And in the lamp room, generation after generation of keepers PT vigil, fulfilling a duty that was older than any of them, more important than any individual. The seasons turned in their eternal cycle, each bringing its own character to the sea and the sky. Gentle springs when the seagulls returned to nest and the air filled with their shrill cries. Bright summers when the sea turned a deep blue and beckoned to brave swimmers. Melancholy autumns when the wind changed direction and the first winter storms began to gather on the horizon. And harsh winters when the waves rose like mountains and the lighthouse became the sole landmark in a world reduced to darkness, wind and water. Through all these seasons, the light remained. Isabel and Miguel grew old together in the lighthouse, their lives intertwined with the rhythm of the place like strands in a rope. They watched their daughter Lucia find her own path, combining the tradition of the lighthouse keeper with modern scientific knowledge. They watch tourists and visitors arrive in search of peace, seeking a connection with something greater than themselves. And they saw how many found it simply by sitting on the lighthouse gallery and watching the light rotate. The lighthouse had become more than just a functional structure. It had become a symbol of continuity, of hope, of the human capacity to keep the faith even when all seems hopeless. And on the darkest nights, when clouds veiled the stars and the moon, when rain fell in thick curtains and the wind howled like a living thing, the light of the Punta Serena lighthouse shone with a constancy that was almost miraculous. It rotated in its eternal cycle, that steady pulse of light piercing the darkness, and in that pulse there was a message that needed no words. The message was simple and profound at the same time. We carry on. Despite everything, despite the silence that had lasted 21 years, despite the storms and the changes and the uncertainties, we carry on. The light remains lit. Someone is watching over you. You are not alone. And so, as the world turned and the decades passed, as new technologies replaced the old and cities grew and changed, the Punta Serena lighthouse remained a fixed point in a world of constant change. Its light continued to shine every night, just as it had done for over 150 years, just as it had done during those extraordinary 21 years when the sea learned to be still. And as long as there were keepers willing to climb those steps and light that lamp, as long as there were those who believed in the value of keeping watch, the light would continue to shine, a beacon in the darkness, a silent promise. The last lighthouse lit on the silent coast, and the first to remember that even after the deepest silence, the light must go on. The last lighthouse still lit on the silent coast. Chapter 2. The guardian of the light that no one visited. The mist spreads like a grey silk cloak over the coast, gliding between the black rocks that emerge from the ocean like the petrified fingers of forgotten giants. The lighthouse stands alone at the tip of the headland, its white tower stained by salt and time, withstanding the relentless onslaught of the wind blowing in from the open sea. It is the early hours of 17 March, 1947, and within that structure of stone and iron, a man awakens to the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks with the regularity of an ancient heart. His name is Thomas Whitmore, though it has been so long since he last spoke his full name that sometimes, in moments of deepest silence, he wonders if he is truly still the same person who arrived here 5 years ago. He is 42 years old, his hair prematurely silvered by solitude and salt spray, and weather-beaten hands that know every step of the spiral staircase, every crack in the brick walls, every imperfection in the glass of the lantern that shields the lamp. The room where he sleeps is small, barely a nook on the second level of the tower. A narrow bed, a small wooden table darkened by damp, a chair with a slightly sloping backrest. On the wall, a framed photograph shows a young woman with a shy smile and light eyes, holding a child of perhaps 3 years old in her arms. The image is faded, the edges yellowed. Tom does not look at it this morning. He has not looked at it directly for weeks. He gets up slowly, with the careful movements of someone who has learnt to conserve energy in the monotony of daily life. The cold seeps in through the cracks, that damp coastal chill that penetrates the bones and settles in like a permanent lodger. He dresses in the same clothes as always, grey woolen trousers, a checked flannel shirt, a thick jumper patched at the elbows. His leather boots rest by the door, waiting for him like faithful companions in a ritual that repeats itself without variation. He climbs the spiral staircase. 143 steps he has counted thousands of times, up to the lantern room at the top of the tower. Here, surrounded by glass panes that multiply the faint light of dawn, lies the heart of the lighthouse. The great Fresnel lens now rests in silence, its perfectly cut prisms capturing and refracting the first rays of the sun as they struggle to break through the clouds. During the night, this lens has rotated tirelessly, casting its beam of light upon the dark waters, a beacon of hope for ships that pass by with ever-decreasing frequency. Thomas checks the mechanisms with the meticulousness of a watchmaker. The system of weights that turns the lens, the polished bronze gears, the oil reservoir that feeds the lamp. Everything is in order, as always. He writes in the logbook in his careful handwriting, 17th of March, 1940s, even 5:30. Northwesterly wind, force 4, moderate visibility, system functioning correctly, no maritime traffic. He has written this last sentence so many times that the words flow automatically from his pen. No maritime traffic. Ships no longer pass this way. The war ended almost 2 years ago, and with it went the need for the coastal routes that used to pass in front of this headland. Large vessels now sail further south, following more direct routes to the ports springing up in distant cities. This lighthouse, which was once crucial to navigation, has become an obsolete sentinel, keeping a watch that no one seems to need anymore. But Thomas carries on. Every night he lights the lamp when the sun sets behind the inland hills. Every morning he extinguishes it when natural light returns. He cleans the lenses, oils the mechanisms, keeps the logs, not because anyone asks him to. He hasn't had a visit from any inspector for over a year. The last supply ship arrived 4 months ago, leaving basic provisions that were meant to last 6. Soon he'll have to ration the food more carefully. He goes down to the galley, a small room at the base of the tower, where he prepares his breakfast. Black tea without sugar, because the sugar ran out weeks ago. Stale bread, softened by dipping it in the tea. A tin of sardines, which he opens carefully, knowing that every tin he uses is one less in the emptying larder. He eats slowly, eating by the east-facing window, watching as the daylight takes hold over the ocean. The sea is restless this morning, the waves crowned with white foam. Seagulls glide in lazy circles, their occasional squawks the only sounds competing with the constant roar of the wind and the water. Thomas recognizes some of these birds, those that return year after year to nest on the nearby rocks. There is one in particular, with a grey patch on its right wing, that comes to perch on the gallery railing almost every morning. He calls her Margaret, though he has never spoken the name aloud. After breakfast, the day's tasks begin. There is always something to repair, something to maintain. The elements are unforgiving, and sea salt is a relentless enemy that corrodes metal and rots wood. Today he decides to inspect the generator shed, a small structure attached to the base of the lighthouse. The diesel generator, which is supposed to serve as a backup for the lamp, hasn't worked for months, but Thomas cleans and checks it anyway, because it's part of his responsibility, because that's what a lighthouse keeper must do. As he works, his hands moving with mechanical efficiency over the engine parts, his mind wanders to the past. He remembers the day he accepted this post. In 1942, when the war was at its darkest and men were needed on all fronts. He could not fight. His left leg, injured in an industrial accident years earlier, disqualified him from military service. But he could serve in other ways. He could keep a light burning. He could be the eyes watching over the coast. He arrived here with a photograph of Eleanor and little Daniel, with the promise that it would be temporary, just until the war was over, just until things returned to normal. Eleanor understood, or at least she said she understood, with that smile of hers that always seemed to hold a sadness she refused to show completely. Daniel, who was 8 at the time, asked him if he would see whales from the lighthouse. Thomas promised he would write to him about every whale he saw. The letters were frequent at first. Eleanor wrote about life in the village, about how Daniel was growing up, about the hardships of rationing and the war news. Thomas replied, telling her about the sea, about the storms, about the occasional ships passing by with their lights barely visible in the night. But over time, the letters grew fewer and fewer. The months between them grew longer. Eleanor's last letter arrived almost a year ago, in April 1946, and in it there was a new distance, a formality that hurt more than any reproach. Thomas finishes with the generator and goes outside, where the wind hits him with renewed force. He heads to the small garden he has tried to maintain on the sheltered side of the lighthouse, a patch of earth where he planted vegetables 2 seasons ago. Now there are barely a few dry cabbage stalks left, and a handful of small potatoes which he digs up with his hands. The soil here is poor, too rocky, too salty, but it is something to tend, something that grows. The hours pass with the slowness of cold honey. Thomas walks along the stony path that circles the headland, checking the boundaries of his little kingdom. There is a low stone wall marking where the lighthouse grounds end, and the steep descent towards the rocks and the sea begins. Beyond that wall, inland, there is a dirt track winding through the heather-covered hills. That track leads to the nearest village, a 3-hour walk away. Thomas has only walked it once in the last 2 years, when he ran completely out of food and had to go and buy provisions with the little money he had left. The village had changed, or perhaps it was he who had changed. People looked at him as if he were a stranger, as if he belonged more to the sea than to the land. In the shop, Mrs. Davies served him with a mixture of pity and bewilderment. "Is it still up there?" she asked him, as if the lighthouse's existence were something that needed confirming. He nodded, paid for his provisions, and walked back along that lonely road, feeling more like an alien with every step. Now, standing by the stone wall, looking out towards that empty road, Thomas wonders when he will see it again. The provisions are running out, but there is a resistance within him, a refusal to abandon his post. Someone has to keep the light burning. Someone has to be here, just in case. Just in case a ship strays from its course. Just in case there's a storm and someone needs to find the coast. Just in case. Evening falls with the sky darkening prematurely. Heavy clouds gather on the western horizon, promising rain or something worse. Thomas climbs back up to the lantern room and begins preparations for the night. He cleans the glass with a soft cloth, removing every speck of salt, every smudge that might dim the light's reach. He fills the oil reservoir carefully, without spilling a single drop. He checks the clockwork mechanism that will rotate the lens during the long hours of darkness. As twilight settles over the sea, Thomas lights the lamp. The flame comes to life with a soft hiss, and slowly the light grows, feeding on the oil, expanding until it fills the lens. And then, like a miracle that repeats itself every night. The beam of light emerges from the tower, casting itself upon the dark waters, turning, a steady pulse of hope in the gathering darkness. Thomas pauses for a moment to observe his work, feeling that simple satisfaction that comes from a job well done. From up here, the world seems small and vast at the same time. The ocean stretches out endlessly, fading into the darkness of the horizon. The stars begin to appear in the gaps between the clouds, and the lighthouse rotates, tirelessly, speaking a language of light that few remember now. He goes down to his room and sits in the chair by the small table. There is a notebook there, its yellowed pages filled with his uneven handwriting. It is a diary, though he would never call it that. Just notes, thoughts, observations, things he writes because he needs to put words down somewhere, because the silence of his days sometimes becomes so thick that it threatens to suffocate him. He writes, "The sea is restless tonight. The seagulls left early, a sign of a storm. The pantry has provisions for perhaps 3 more weeks. The lens mechanism will need new oil soon. I haven't seen any ships for 19 days. Pause, the pen suspended over the paper. Then he adds, I wonder if anyone still knows I'm here." He closes the notebook and puts it in the drawer of the bedside table. He lies down on the bed without undressing completely, because the night is cold and his sleep is light. He needs to be ready to get up every few hours, to go upstairs and check the lamp, to make sure the light is still spinning. The storm arrives at midnight. Thomas hears it approaching, the change in the wind's tone, the more violent pounding of the waves against the rocks. The rain begins as a gentle curtain and quickly turns into a deluge. The wind howls around the tower, making the windows rattle in their frames. Thunder rumbles in the distance, drawing nearer. He gets up and goes up to the lantern room. Visibility is almost zero. The rain is so thick he can barely see beyond the outer gallery. But the light continues to rotate, cutting through the storm, reaching who knows what distance on this wild night. Thomas checks everything twice, 3 times. The oil, the flame, the mechanism. Everything works. Everything holds. There is something primal about being here, at the top of this tower, whilst nature unleashes its fury. Thomas feels the power of the wind, the violence of the sea, the absolute indifference of the elements. And yet, his little light continues to shine. It is a declaration of will, of resilience. "We are small," says the light, "but we are here." The storm lasts until dawn. When it finally subsides, leaving a washed-out sky and a sea still churning, Thomas carries out his damage assessment. A few tiles torn from the roof of the generator shed, a window with a fresh crack in the glass, branches from the few bushes growing nearby scattered everywhere. Nothing he cannot repair. As he works clearing the debris, his eyes catch sight of something on the rocky beach at the foot of the headland. Something that wasn't there before. He squints against the bright morning light. It is large, dark, possibly debris washed up by the storm. He makes his way down the steep path carefully, his boots seeking purchase on the wet, slippery rocks. It takes him nearly half an hour to reach the beach. And there, amongst the seaweed-covered rocks, he finds a rowing boat. It is damaged, with a hole in the side and one of the oars broken. But it is a boat, something he hasn't seen on his beach in all these years. He looks around, his heart beating faster. Is anyone there? Does anyone need help? But he finds nothing but the boat. No bodies. No sign that there were any passengers. Perhaps it came loose from a ship during the storm. Perhaps it drifted empty for miles before running aground here. Thomas examines the boat more closely. It is old, the paint peeling and faded. On the middle bench there is a name painted, almost erased by time, Esperanza. He runs his fingers over the letters, feeling the unevenness of the wood beneath the paint. An idea begins to form in his mind. He could repair this boat. He has tools. He has time. He could make it sail again. And then what? Leave? Abandon the lighthouse? He shakes his head, banishing the thought. He cannot leave. Someone has to keep the light burning. But the idea stays with him as he drags the boat further up the beach, out of reach of the tide. It stays with him over the following days, as he goes about his routine tasks. The boat is there, waiting, like a possibility he doesn't dare fully consider. The weeks pass. The provisions dwindle. Thomas will ration the tea, then the bread, then everything else. He fishes when he can, catching crabs in the tide pools. Occasionally, a fish, if he's lucky, is less than number. 2 hash is greater than it's not enough. It's never enough. But he manages. One afternoon, whilst cleaning the lantern's glass, he sees something on the horizon. A dark shape against the pale sky. A ship. The first in weeks. His heart races involuntarily. He watches as the vessel moves slowly across his field of vision, too far away to make out any details, but definitely a ship. He waits, holding his breath to see if it draws nearer. But the ship continues on its course, drifting away, gradually disappearing into the mist of the distance. It didn't need his light. It didn't need his lighthouse. It simply passed by, unaware that someone was watching it, that someone was waiting. Thomas slowly descends the stairs. He sits in the kitchen, in the twilight of the evening turning to night. He doesn't turn on a lamp. He sits in the darkness, listening to the beating of the ocean, the whisper of the wind. For the first time in 5 years, he allows himself to think the unthinkable. What if he didn't turn on the light tonight? Who would notice? Who would know? The boat that has just passed didn't look this way. Neither did the others before it. The coast is empty, the sea indifferent. But just as he thinks this, his legs carry him up the stairs. His hands perform the familiar movements. Wipe, fill, light. The flame comes to life. The light begins to spin, because this is what it does, because this is its duty, because so Mion, somewhere, at some point, might need it. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Thomas listens to the ocean and thinks of Eleanor and Daniel. He wonders how tall the boy is now. 14 years old. Almost a man. Will he remember? Will he remember the mornings when they walked together to the harbour? The stories Thomas used to tell him about ships and sailors? Or has he become a blurred figure in his memory? The father who left and never returned? Guilt is a constant companion here. In the long hours of the night, guilt for having chosen this, for having stayed when I could have left, for having found a strange peace in solitude when I should be longing to return. Because the most terrible thing, what he would never admit out loud, is that part of him has come to love this life. Its simplicity, the absence of complications, of difficult decisions, of disappointments. Here, his days have a clear purpose: to keep the light, to resist, to exist. There is nothing more asked of him, nothing more he can fail at. Days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months. It is June now, 1947, and summer brings longer days and shorter nights. Thomas has started working on the boat. He isn't sure why, just that he needs to do something with his hands, something different from the endless chores at the lighthouse. He patches the hole in the side with pieces of wood he tears from old crates. He carves a new oar from a bee he found in the storeroom. It's not a perfect job, but it's functional. The boat takes shape under his hands, slowly transforming from a battered wreck into something that might float again. He doesn't think about what he'll do with it when it's finished. He focuses solely on the process, on the work. Every blow of the hammer, every stroke of the sandpaper is a form of meditation, an escape from the thoughts that haunt him. One day in July, whilst he is working on the boat, he hears a sound he hasn't heard in so long that he barely recognizes it. Voices. Human voices. He lifts his head, listening. Yes, definitely voices, coming from the road. His first instinct is to hide, to retreat towards the lighthouse. But he forces himself to stay still, to wait. Two figures appear on the crest of the hill. A man and a boy, walking along the path towards the lighthouse. Thomas stands up slowly, his legs stiff from crouching for so long. He runs his hands through his hair, suddenly conscious of his appearance. He hasn't shaved for weeks. His clothes are threadbare and stained. The visitors approach. The man is young, perhaps 30, with the sturdy build of someone who works outdoors. The boy, perhaps 10 or 11, stares at the lighthouse with wide eyes. "Good afternoon," says the man, stopping at a respectful distance. "Are you the lighthouse keeper?" Thomas nods, his voice hoarse from disuse when he finally speaks. "I am. My name is Robert Ashford," says the man. "This is my son, Peter. We're visiting the village. Peter wanted to see the lighthouse. We hope we're not disturbing you." "You're not disturbing us," says Thomas, though he isn't sure if it's true. The presence of other people feels strange, intrusive, as if they've entered a private space. But at the same time, there's something in him that reaches out towards them, hungry for human contact. The boy, Peter, steps forward. "Can I see the light, sir? The big one that spins?" Thomas looks at the father, who nods in agreement. "I suppose so," says Thomas. "Follow me." He leads them inside the lighthouse, up the spiral staircase. He moves with the confidence of someone who knows every step, whilst his visitors climb more slowly, the boy counting the steps under his breath. In the lantern room, Peter approaches the windows, pressing his nose against the glass. It's very high up, he whispers, looking down at the rocky beach far below. 42 meters, says Thomas. From here, on a clear night, the light can be seen 30 kilometers away. Do people still come to light it every night? Asks Robert. I live here, says Thomas. I light it myself. On your own? Robert's surprise is genuine. I thought there were always several keepers. There used to be, says Thomas, before the war. But now it's just me. There is an awkward silence. The boy continues to explore with his eyes, fascinated by the mechanisms, by the view. Robert looks at Thomas with something that could be pity or admiration. It is hard to tell. Do you get many visitors? Asks Robert. Thomas shakes his head. You're the first ones in. I can't remember how long. It must be lonely, says Robert softly. Thomas shrugs. It is what it is. They spend perhaps half an hour in the lighthouse. Thomas shows them how the clockwork mechanism works, how the Fresnel lens multiplies the light. Peter asks endless questions, his curiosity boundless. Robert listens in silence, watching Thomas with an intensity that is uncomfortable. When they finally get ready to leave, Robert hesitates at the door. Is he all right? Here, on his own? Does he have enough food? Provisions? I'll manage, says Thomas, too proud to admit the truth. Robert reaches into his rucksack and pulls out a parcel wrapped in paper. My wife made more than we needed. Fresh bread, cheese, some ham. Please, take it. Thomas wants to refuse it, but his empty stomach betrays him. He accepts the parcel with a murmur of thanks. We'll be back, says Peter excitedly. Can we come back, Dad? If the gentleman doesn't mind, says Robert, looking at Thomas. Thomas nods, unable to speak. He watches them as they walk down the path, their figures growing smaller, finally disappearing over the crest of the hill. He remains standing long after they have go. Nay, the food parcel in his hands, feeling something he hasn't felt in a long time. A connection. A reminder that there is a world beyond this headland, beyond his stone tower and its rotating light. That night, as he eats the fresh bread and cheese, savoring every bite, Thomas thinks of the boy, of his innocent wonder, of his endless questions. He reminds him of Daniel. He reminds him of a time when he himself saw the world with that capacity for wonder. The following days are strange. Thomas finds himself waiting, looking towards the road, wondering if they will return. and part of him hopes they won't, because their presence disturbs the carefully constructed stillness of his existence. But another part, a part that has been dormant for a long time, hopes they will. 2 weeks pass. Thomas has almost decided it was a one-off visit, a fleeting moment of human connection that will not be repeated. And then, one August afternoon, whilst he is on the beach working on the boat, he hears voices again. This time there are 3 figures: Robert, Peter, and a woman who must be Robert's wife. They're carrying a picnic basket, and Peter runs ahead, waving enthusiastically. Mr. Thomas, we're back. And so something new begins. The Ashfords start visiting him regularly, perhaps once a week. They never stay long, just a few hours. But they bring food. They bring news from the outside world. They bring life, tea. Oh, this place of stillness and silence. Sarah Ashford, the wife, is a practical woman with nimble hands. She notices Thomas's threadbare clothes, and on her next visit brings needles and thread, mending his shirts whilst they chat. Robert helps with larger repairs, fixing the cracked window, reinforcing the door of the generator shed. Peter explores every corner of the headland, collecting shells and stones, filling the space with his youthful energy. Thomas finds himself waiting for these visits. The days between them feel longer now, the loneliness more pronounced by contrast. He begins to prepare for their arrival, cleaning the kitchen, tidying his things. He shaves. He bathes in the cold water he collects from the rain. One afternoon, sitting on the lighthouse veranda whilst Peter plays on the rocks below, Robert asks him why he stayed. "I mean," says Robert, lighting his pipe, "the war ended over 2 years ago." "Why haven't you gone home?" Thomas looks towards the horizon, where the sun begins its descent towards the line where the sky meets the sea. "This is my home now," he says at last. "At least, what's left of it." "Do you have a family?" "I had. A wife, a son." Thomas pauses. "I might still have them. I'm not sure." Robert doesn't press him, and Thomas is grateful for that. They sit in friendly silence, the smoke from Robert's pipe curling in the still afternoon air. "The boat," says Robert after a while. "Are you thinking of using it?" Thomas shrugs. "I don't know. I just needed something to do with my hands." "You could use it to get to the village," suggests Robert. "It would be quicker than walking. The sea is calm most summer days. The idea takes root in Thomas's mind. The village. He could go to the village. He could see other people, buy provisions, perhaps send a letter. The next time the Ashfords visit, Thomas timidly asks them if they could take a letter to the village for him, to post it. Sarah agrees immediately, and Thomas spends the afternoon trying to write down words that have been trapped in his chest for so long. "Dear Eleanor," he begins, "I don't know if this letter will reach you. I don't know if you'll want to read it if it does, but I need to try." The words flow with difficulty at first, then more easily. He tells her about the lighthouse, about the loneliness, about how days turn into months almost without noticing. He asks about Daniel. He tells her he thinks of them every day. She ends with, "I don't expect your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I'm still here, keeping my light burning, doing my duty, and that if you ever wanted to, if Daniel ever wanted to, you'd be welcome to come, to see what I've been keeping all these years." He seals the letter with trembling hands and hands it to Sarah. She takes it carefully, as if she understands its weight. Weeks pass. Thomas does not expect a reply, or so he tells himself. But he finds his eyes drifting towards the path more often, his heart leaping at every sound that might be footsteps approaching. September arrives with greyer skies and rougher seas. The Ashfords' visits become less frequent as the weather worsens. On their last visit before returning to the city, where Robert works, Sarah hands Thomas a parcel. "For the winter," she says, "preserves, stale bread, a few blankets, and this." She hands him a letter. Thomas recognizes the handwriting immediately. Eleanor. With fingers that barely obey him, he opens the envelope. The letter is brief. Eleanor writes that she received his message, that Daniel is well, growing fast, doing well at school, that she has moved on with her life, found work in a textile factory, made friends. She doesn't mention coming to visit him. She doesn't mention a future together. But there is no bitterness in her words either. Just a weary acceptance of the way things are. She ends, "Take care of yourself, Thomas. Keep your light shining. It's what you've always done best." Thomas folds the letter carefully and puts it in the drawer next to the notebook. He sits for a long time after the Ashfords have left, staring at the photograph on the wall. The young woman and the little boy. Ghosts of a life he left behind. Winter arrives with a ferocity Thomas has never experienced before. Storm after storm lashes the coast. The wind howls for days on end. The waves crash against the rocks with such force that he can feel the vibration in the tower. The snow falls, a rare occurrence on this coast, covering everything in a white blanket that makes the world seem silenced, as if someone had placed cotton wool over the universe's ears. Thomas moves through these storms like an automaton. He keeps the light on, keeps the fire going in the stove, survives. The days are so dark that sometimes it is hard to tell when night ends and day begins. He counts the time by the lamp. On, off, on, off. The provisions Sarah left her are slowly running out. She rations every bite. Some days she eats only once. A thin soup made from tinned food and water. She loses weight. Her clothes hang loosely on her increasingly thin frame. But the light keeps turning. Every night, without fail, because that is what it does. Because someone might need it. Because if it stops, if it lets the darkness take over the lighthouse, then what has all this been for? What has the sacrifice been for? In January 1948, during a lull between storms, Thomas sees smoke rising from the distant village. Lots of smoke. He watches for hours, wondering what is burning, if the people are safe. But he is too weak to make the journey, too exhausted by months of deprivation. The smoke eventually clears. Life goes on. Thomas carries on. February brings slight relief. The storms become less frequent. There are days of pale sunshine between the clouds. Thomas goes outside when he can, moving slowly, his joints stiff from the cold and lack of movement. He finds the boat where he left it, now covered in snow. He cleans it with numb hands. He stares at it for a long time. He could use it. He could go to the village, get some food, perhaps even seek help. But something stops him. The same stubborn pride that has kept him here all this time is less than #2 number, is greater than he cannot abandon his post. He cannot leave. March arrives with winds that smell of change. The seagulls return, nesting on the rocks. The sea, though still cold, seems less furious. And one day, when Thomas climbs up to the lantern room for his morning inspection, he sees something that makes his heart stop. A boat. Not on the distant horizon, but close by. very close. A small vessel, a fishing boat, sailing straight towards the headland. Thomas runs down the stairs, moving faster than he has in months. He steps outside just as the boat approaches the rocky beach. Two men jump into the shallow water, dragging the boat towards the shore. One of them is Robert Ashford. "Thomas!" shouts Robert, waving. "Thomas, we're here." Thomas walks towards them, his legs unsteady on the uneven ground. Robert reaches him first, and the shock on his face is clear. "My God," Robert murmurs. "What's happened to you?" Thomas realizes how he must look. Gaunt, almost skeletal, his clothes hanging like rags. "I'm fine," he says, but the words sound hollow even to his own ears. The other man is the village doctor, Dr. Harrison. He insists on examining Thomas immediately, right there on the beach. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, the onset of frostbite on several toes. He needs medical attention. He needs food. He needs to get out of here. "I can't leave," says Thomas weakly. "The light." "Yes, Omion has to keep the light on." Robert exchanges a glance with the doctor. "Thomas," he says gently, "an official letter has been sent. The lighthouse is to be closed. An automatic lighthouse is to be installed, one that operates without the need for a keeper." It takes a moment for the words to sink in. Closed. Automatic. No keeper. "When?" asks Thomas. "The letter arrived 2 weeks ago. We sent messages, but got no reply. That's why we came to fetch you." 2 weeks. There was a letter, an official notification, and he didn't even know. The supply ship that should have come, that should have brought him news, never arrived. "They'll be coming in April," Robert continues, "to install the new system. Thomas, your duty here is done. You've more than done your bit. Now it's time to go home." "Home?" Thomas looks towards the lighthouse, its white tower against the grey sky. This has been his home for 6 years. He knows every stone, every sound, every shift in the wind. What is home if not this? But he looks at Robert, at Dr. Harrison, and sees the genuine concern on their faces. He sees that if he stays, if he insists on staying, he will likely die here before another winter comes. Let me. His voice breaks. Let me light it one more time. Just tonight. One last time. Robert nods. Of course. They spend the day making preparations. Dr. Harrison does what he can for Thomas, giving him hot broth from a flask, bandaging his feet. Robert climbs up to the lighthouse and brings down some of Thomas's belongings. The notebook, the photograph, some clothes. As the sun begins to set, Thomas climbs the stairs for the last time. Every step is familiar. Each one holds its own memories. This is where he once slipped during a storm. This is where he found a mouse's nest. This is where he sat and wept the first time the loneliness became unbearable. In the lantern room, he performs the rituals for the last time. He cleans the glass with extra care. He fills the oil reservoir to the brim. He adjusts the clockwork mechanism, making sure it will run perfectly all night long. And when the time comes, she lights the lamp. The flame comes to life, as it has done thousands of times before. The light fills the lens, multiplies, and is projected towards the darkened sea. The beam begins to rotate, slowly, hypnotically, tracing its circular path across the waters. Thomas stands in the center of the spinning light, and for a moment it is as if he can see all the nights he has spent here, all superimposed. Every storm weathered, every unseen ship, every hour of solitude endured, all building up to this moment, this final vigil. Robert climbs up and stands beside him in silence. Together they watch as the night deepens, as the stars emerge one by one. The light spins and spins, speaking its silent message to the void. Was it worth it? Robert asks softly. All these years, all the loneliness, was it worth it? Thomas considers the question. He thinks of Eleanor and Daniel, of the lost years he will never get back. He thinks of the ships that never needed his light, of the nights of doubt and despair. But he also thinks of the storms he weathered, of duty fulfilled, of the light that stayed alight when it would have been so easy to let it die. I don't know, he finally says, and it is the most honest answer he can give. But it was what I had to do, what I chose to do, and I did it as best I could. They remained there until midnight. Then Thomas turns off the lamp for the last time, stops the clockwork mechanism, closes the logbook with a final entry. 18th of March, 1948. Guardian Thomas Whitmore's final watch. Light out. Duty done. They descend the stairs in the darkness. Thomas looks back once at the dark silhouette of the tower against the starry sky. Then he follows Robert towards the beach, towards the waiting boat, towards the world from which he has been separated for so long. At dawn, as Robert's boat carries them away from the headland, Thomas watches the lighthouse grow smaller in the distance. It seems strangely bare without its light, just an empty tower on an empty coast. But the sun is rising, painting the sky in pinks and golds, and in that new light, he can see other distant lighthouses along the coast, each waiting its turn to be replaced by machines that need no keepers, that know neither solitude nor duty nor sacrifice. The sea is calm this morning, the boat gliding gently over the waves. Thomas keeps his eyes on the lighthouse until it disappears completely from view, swallowed up by the distance and the mist. And then at last he turns forward, towards the village growing larger on the horizon, towards whatever future awaits him there. In his pocket, he carries the folded photograph of Eleanor and Daniel. In his mind, he carries 6 years of illuminated nights, of weathered storms, of light held against the darkness. It is all he has left of his time as keeper of the lighthouse that no one ever visited, of the days when he was the sole witness to the dawn and the dusk on that lonely headland. The wind shifts, carrying with it the scent of the mainland, of smoke from chimneys, of human life. Thomas takes a deep breath, filling his lungs with that different air, and allows himself, for the first time in years, to wonder what will come next.
Release the tension in your forehead. Relax the muscles around your eyes. Let your arms rest completely, heavy and warm at either side of your body. Your breath now flows naturally, like gentle waves lapping at the shore and receding effortlessly. The stories you have heard tonight slowly fade away, becoming distant whispers that you no longer need to follow. If this journey through time has served you well, you can support this space by liking, subscribing, or sharing your thoughts in the comments. That way, more people seeking rest may find refuge here. And if you are still awake, there is another story waiting in silence, ready to guide you deeper into sleep. But for now, let the voices of the past fade gently away. Let the names, dates, and events melt into the mist of the night's oblivion. The story can wait until tomorrow. Close your eyes. Let go of everything. Rest deeply, and may you have sweet dreams.